June 1944. The morning mist clings to the bocage. Dew gathers on the steel hide of a waiting tank, an M4 Sherman, its olive paint streaked with dust and sweat. Inside, 5 men breathe in silence, listening to the muffled thunder of artillery somewhere beyond the hedgerows. A sergeant wipes grime from his periscope and mutters, "We move." The engine growls to life, a deep, mechanical heartbeat echoing through the valley. Tracks grind into the earth as the Sherman edges forward, turret scanning, gun elevated slightly, waiting for an enemy they can't yet see. Across the field, hidden beneath a line of trees, a tiger eye waits. Its long 88mm cannon rests like a predator's fang. Through crystal-clear Zeiss optics, the German gunner studies the horizon. One shell, one breath, one decision, and steel will decide who lives. The battlefield holds its breath. Then, the flash. The roar. The meeting of 2 philosophies of war, one born of perfection, the other of persistence. But this moment was not born in Normandy. It began years earlier, in factories, in doctrine rooms, in the minds of men who thought they could design invincibility. The story of the Sherman and the German Panzer did not begin on the beaches of Normandy. It began in the shadows of a broken world after World War I. A time when nations still counted their dead and plotted how never to lose again. The seeds of steel. Germany, shackled by the Treaty of Versailles, was forbidden from developing tanks. Yet behind closed doors, engineers in Stuttgart and Munich continued to dream. They studied the lumbering British Mark IVs of the Great War and vowed to build something faster, deadlier, smarter. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, secret experiments took place, sometimes even in the Soviet Union, far from the eyes of Allied inspectors. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he tore up the treaty's restrictions. What followed was an explosion of innovation. The Panzer I, Panzer II, and later the formidable Panzer III and Panzer IV. These machines became the backbone of the German Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that stunned the world. By 1939, Germany's armored divisions were not merely machines. They were doctrine in motion. The Blitzkrieg philosophy combined speed, coordination, and shock. Tanks would punch through enemy lines, aircraft would cripple supply routes, infantry would follow fast, encircling and crushing what remained. Europe fell in months. Poland, France, the Low Countries, all swept aside by the roar of German engines and the precision of their armored formations. Across the Atlantic. In contrast, the United States had no grand armored vision. The U.S. Army entered the 1940s still shaped by the thinking of the last war, tanks as infantry support, not independent strike weapons. America's few armored units trained with outdated designs, often using trucks painted to look like tanks. But the fall of France in 1940 changed everything. Suddenly, the United States realized that modern war would be decided by machines, by who could produce, supply, and repair them faster than the other side could destroy them. Under the leadership of General George C. Marshall and the newly formed Armored Force, the U.S. began a crash program to create a tank that could be mass-produced, reliable, and adaptable. The result would become one of the most iconic machines of the 20th century, the M4 Sherman. The Sherman's philosophy. Introduced in 1942, the M4 Sherman was not designed to be invincible. It was designed to be available. It could be built in dozens of factories, transported easily by ship, and repaired quickly in the field. It was lighter than German tanks, easier to maintain, and could traverse terrain where heavier armor might bog down. Its 75mm gun could destroy most enemy tanks of its time, at least until the Germans rolled out the Tigers and Panthers. But when the Sherman was conceived, it was never meant to duel heavy armor. Its role was combined arms, working alongside infantry, artillery, and air power in a synchronized rhythm of war. While the Sherman's design reflected American pragmatism, Germany's tanks reflected something different, a belief in technological superiority. The Tiger I, when it appeared in 1942, was a fortress of steel, nearly 60 tons of armor, armed with the fearsome 88mm kilowatt K-36 gun, capable of destroying a Sherman at more than 1,500 meters. Yet, in every machine lies its maker's philosophy. The German pursuit of perfection came with a cost, complexity, maintenance, and limited production. The American pursuit of efficiency came with another vulnerability. Two paths, one collision course. As the war stretched into 1943, both sides were accelerating toward a clash neither could avoid. Germany's armored corps, stretched across the vast steppes of Russia, began to feel the limits of their machines. Broken gearboxes, fuel shortages, and mechanical breakdowns haunted their campaigns. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, U.S. factories were running day and night. By 1944, they were producing more than 2,000 Shermans per month, a river of armor flowing toward Europe. The question was never just which tank was better. It was which system of war could endure, the precision of the few or the reliability of the many. And by the spring of 1944, the answer was about to be tested. On the beaches of Normandy by 1943, the tide of the Second World War had begun to turn. The once unbreakable blitzkrieg machine was cracking under the weight of its own ambitions. The Soviet Red Army was pushing west after the brutal struggle at Stalingrad, and German tank crews were learning that even the mightiest armor could burn in the snows of the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, far across the Atlantic, American industry was awakening like a giant stirred from slumber. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago transformed from civilian production lines into instruments of war. Car companies built tanks, refrigerator plants produced aircraft parts, and railroads carried a ceaseless flow of men and machines toward the ports. The Industrial War. No army in history had ever fought a war of such industrial scale. For every German Tiger that rolled out of its complex production halls in Kassel or Henschel, dozens of Shermans were being assembled in American plants. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was a logistical miracle. Parts standardized, engines interchangeable, designs simplified for mass output. The US could replace what it lost, Germany could not. Each destroyed Tiger represented months of labor, scarce materials, and highly skilled workers. But each Sherman represented a day's work in 1,000 factories. Still, numbers alone did not guarantee victory. The real challenge was to bring these tanks into the fight, across oceans, through mine-laden beaches, and into the heart of occupied Europe. The strategic picture. In early 1944, preparations for Operation Overlord were underway, the Allied invasion of Western Europe. The Germans had fortified the Atlantic Wall, believing that any attack would come at the Pas de Calais. Yet, the Allies aimed for Normandy, a region of rolling fields, hedgerows, and narrow country lanes, terrain that would soon prove both a blessing and a curse for tank warfare. The German armored divisions stationed in France were among the best in the world. Elite units like the Panzer Le Division, 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and 2nd Panzer Division were equipped with Panzer IVs, Panthers, and a handful of Tigers. These units were well-trained, experienced, and ready to exploit any Allied weakness. The Allies, in contrast, relied on a mixture of American, British, and Canadian armored forces, most of them equipped with the M4 Sherman. British forces fielded their own variants, including the Sherman Firefly, retrofitted with the powerful 17-pounder gun capable of piercing even a Tiger's frontal armor. But before these Shermans could prove their worth, they had to survive the landing itself. The approach to Normandy. As the Allied Armada crossed the English Channel in June 1944, more than 4,000 landing craft, 156,000 troops, and nearly 1,500 tanks prepared for the assault. Among them were the so-called DD Shermans, amphibious versions fitted with canvas flotation screens and propellers. Many sank before reaching shore, but those that did became the first tanks to fight in France. Once inland, the terrain of Normandy shattered any illusion of open maneuver. The bocage, dense hedgerows with earthen embankments, turned every field into a fortress. Visibility dropped to mere meters. German anti-tank guns and ambush positions ruled the countryside. The Sherman, designed for mobility and speed, suddenly found itself fighting a hidden enemy in close quarters, where a single well-placed 88mm shell could turn it into a fireball. German tank crews, many veterans of the Eastern Front, knew how to use this terrain. They positioned their Panthers and Tigers on reverse slopes or behind natural cover, waiting for Allied tanks to expose themselves. The first days after D-Day were brutal. Entire platoons of Shermans lost to a single German gunner. Two doctrines collide. The Americans responded not with panic, but with adaptation. They coordinated artillery, infantry, and airstrikes, using P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers to neutralize German armor from above. The lesson was clear. A tank didn't have to be the best if it fought as part of a system. Meanwhile, German commanders such as Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel were painfully aware that their armored forces were being ground down. The Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee air superiority, and the once feared panzers were increasingly forced into defensive roles. Every Tiger that broke down or ran out of fuel was a symbol of a war machine collapsing under its own weight. As summer approached, the stage was set for the greatest armored duels of the Western Front, where the German obsession with superiority would meet the American faith in numbers, teamwork, and relentless pressure. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, two worlds of steel were about to collide. Angle 1. Human. The men inside the machines. Inside every tank was a small world of fear, noise, and trust. The Sherman, though larger than a family car, was still a cramped metal shell. 5 men living shoulder to shoulder. Commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Their fates were bound together in a space no wider than 2 meters. For the Americans, most of these crews were young, 19, maybe 20. Many had never seen Europe before stepping onto its beaches. They were factory workers, farmers, students, thrown into a war of machines. Training was short, often rushed. Few had fired their main gun in live combat before facing the panzers. They called their tank a Ronson, after the cigarette lighter, because it lights every time. The name was grimly accurate. When a Sherman was hit, its gasoline engine and thin armor often turned the crew compartment into a furnace. The survival rate for a direct penetration was low. Veterans recalled seeing tanks burst into flames in seconds, giving their crews little time to escape. Yet, despite the losses, morale stayed astonishingly high. Why? Because the Sherman crews fought not alone, but as part of something vast. They had artillery on call, air cover overhead, and replacements waiting. Each time a Sherman burned, another would arrive within days. In contrast, German tankers knew that every loss was irreplaceable. German crews, by 1944, were hardened professionals. Many had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front. Their tanks were their pride, symbols of engineering excellence and national power. To them, the Tiger or Panther was not just a machine. It was a weapon of mastery, a fortress on tracks. But behind the armor lay exhaustion. They fought outnumbered, under skies owned by Allied aircraft, with dwindling fuel and ammunition. Their machines were magnificent, but their world was shrinking. Inside a Tiger, the gunner adjusted his optics and whispered distances in meters. The commander gave calm orders, the loader worked in silence. The German tank interior was cold, efficient, an engineer's dream. The Sherman, by contrast, felt human, almost improvised. Rough paint, canvas seats, the smell of oil and sweat. 2 worlds. One purpose: survive another day. In the hedgerows of Normandy, this human reality played out hour by hour. When a Sherman platoon advanced, the men inside were not thinking of doctrine or industry. They were thinking of the gunner behind that next corner, waiting with an 88. Angle 2, tactical, terrain, tactics, and adaptation. Normandy was not tank country. The rolling fields of bocage, earth embankments topped with thick, centuries-old hedges, created a nightmare for armored warfare. Visibility was almost zero. Each field was a trap, each intersection a potential ambush. The Germans had turned these hedgerows into a defense network. Anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust teams, and hidden Panthers lurked behind every bend. A Tiger could dominate an entire field without ever revealing itself. Allied tanks had to expose their hulls just to see their target, often fatally. In the first weeks after D-Day, entire Sherman units were wiped out in such ambushes. Commanders quickly learned that textbook tactics didn't work here. Columns had to move slowly, supported by infantry clearing each hedge. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division and 3rd Armored Division began developing improvised tools to cut through the terrain: bulldozer blades, welded prongs, and even explosive charges. One of the most ingenious inventions came from a Tennessee sergeant named Curtis G. Cullen. Using scrap iron from German roadblocks, he created the Rhino device, steel tusks welded to the front of a Sherman, capable of ripping through hedgerows. Within weeks, hundreds of tanks carried them, turning the Bockage from a fortress into an obstacle course. German commanders were shocked. What they believed was impenetrable terrain suddenly became vulnerable to American ingenuity. Still, tactics alone couldn't neutralize the difference in firepower. A Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor, even at close range. The German 88mm, on the other hand, could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. So the Americans adapted again, not by building heavier tanks, but by changing how they fought. Shermans would flank, maneuver, and overwhelm a target through numbers and coordination. Artillery and aircraft were called in to finish what their guns couldn't. A German Tiger might destroy 5 Shermans in a single engagement, but when the 6th and 7th arrived with air support, the outcome changed. Tactics became a matter of persistence. The Americans learned to use smoke screens to mask movement, to bait German tanks into revealing their positions, and to call in cab ranks of fighter bombers that could strike within minutes. In Normandy's fields, the U.S. Army learned the art of combined arms warfare, the seamless coordination of air, armor, and infantry. It was messy, brutal, and costly, but it worked. For the first time, the legendary German tank divisions found themselves reacting instead of dictating. Their superiority in quality was being challenged by a new kind of warfare, one driven by adaptability and relentless supply. And soon, that difference in philosophy, precision versus production, would define the next stage of the conflict. Shall I continue to section 2 of Angles, almost equals 900 words, covering the technological, industrial strategic, and Angle 3, technological, the machines of war. In design, the Tiger and the Sherman could not have been more different. The Tiger I, introduced in 1942, weighed nearly 60 tons, twice the mass of a Sherman. Its 88mm kilowatt K-36 gun, adapted from the famous anti-aircraft weapon, was capable of piercing any Allied tank at over 1,500 meters. Its frontal armor, up to 100mm thick, was nearly impervious to the Sherman's 75mm gun. It was the tank that embodied Hitler's obsession with the superweapon, heavy, precise, and intimidating. But its strength was also its weakness. The Tiger's gearbox was fragile. Its maintenance required expert crews. A single broken track could immobilize it for days. It consumed enormous amounts of fuel, which Germany increasingly lacked. On paper, it was invincible. On the battlefield, it was often stranded before it could fight. The Panther, introduced a year later, was a response to the Soviet T-34. Sleeker, faster, with sloped armor and a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun, it combined lethality with maneuverability. Yet even it suffered from reliability issues, engines that overheated, transmissions that cracked under strain, and production shortages that left entire divisions under-equipped. The M4 Sherman, by contrast, was born from a different philosophy. It was a medium tank, not heavy, not exceptional, but balanced. Its 75mm gun could handle enemy armor early in the war, and later models upgraded to a 76mm gun with better armor-piercing rounds. The Sherman's Continental R975 radial engine was reliable and easy to repair. Crews could replace damaged tracks in hours, not days. Its armor, though thinner, was sloped, a subtle design choice that improved survivability. And perhaps most importantly, its rotating turret, hydraulic traverse, and stabilized gun allowed quicker aiming and firing on the move, something few German tanks could match. When the British fitted it with their powerful 17-pounder gun, the result was the Sherman Firefly, capable of destroying even a Tiger at long range. For the first time, Allied crews could fight on more equal terms. Technology was no longer just about who built the best machine. It was about who could build the right one, fast enough, and in enough numbers to change the tide of war. Angle 4, Industrial and Strategic, Quantity versus Quality. Beneath the battles raged another war, one of factories, workers, and supply chains. Germany's industrial system, despite its engineering brilliance, was collapsing under Allied bombing and resource starvation. Factories that produced Tigers and Panthers could not replace the losses sustained in both East and West. Each Tiger required nearly 300,000 man-hours to build. The same effort could produce 10 Shermans. American industry was operating on a scale humanity had never seen. By 1945, the US had produced over 49,000 Shermans. Germany, fewer than 1,400 Tigers. Every Sherman came with a full logistical ecosystem: spare parts, mechanics, fuel, and recovery vehicles. A Sherman that broke down could be repaired within hours. A Tiger that broke down might be abandoned forever. This contrast defined the Western Front. German divisions could field perhaps 100 operational tanks at a time. American divisions could field hundreds and replace them weekly. When a Tiger was destroyed, it was a tragedy. When a Sherman was destroyed, it was a statistic. But this was not cold indifference, it was strategy. The Allies understood that war was a matter of endurance. Industrial power was the foundation of victory. The Sherman, cheap and numerous, represented that truth better than any other machine of the war. Behind the lines, Detroit, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh became as vital to victory as Omaha Beach or Bastogne. Tanks rolled off assembly lines like clockwork, each stamped with a serial number and shipped across the Atlantic. It was a war of steel and stamina, and Germany was running out of both. Angle 5, psychological, the fear and the myth. For those who fought, the most terrifying word on the radio was Tiger. The psychological weight of the German heavy tank was immense. Stories spread among Allied troops, tales of shells bouncing off its armor, of Shermans destroyed before they could even aim. Some of these accounts were exaggerated, many were true. The Tiger was not just a tank. It was a symbol of invincibility, an engine of fear. Allied crews often fired multiple rounds before realizing they were hopelessly outgunned. Veterans described the dread of hearing the deep, mechanical growl of its Maybach engine, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. But over time, reality broke the myth. Air superiority, artillery coordination, and numerical pressure began to erode the aura of German dominance. Crews who had once feared the Tiger learned to call in airstrikes, flank in groups, or target its weaker sides. A Panther or Tiger destroyed by a Sherman team became a celebrated victory, a reversal of the legend. The Germans, meanwhile, began to feel a different kind of fear: exhaustion. They faced enemies who never seemed to run out of tanks, men, or ammunition. Their skies filled with Allied bombers. Their roads were strafed daily. The once proud Panzer divisions, symbols of lightning warfare, were now retreating through mud and ruins. The myth of the Tiger remained, but it had become a ghost of an empire in decline. And by the summer of 1944, that ghost would meet the unstoppable tide of Allied firepower in one of the defining clashes of the Western Front. The moment was coming when all philosophies, engineering, industrial, and human, would be tested in the furnace of combat. The turning point was near. The fields of Normandy were about to explode with the fire of tank duels that would decide the fate of Europe, the furnace of Normandy. By late June 1944, the Allies had pushed inland from the beaches, but every mile was earned in blood and steel. The fields around Curran, Saint-Lô, and Villers-Bocage became graveyards of tanks. Wrecks burning in the hedgerows, tracks twisted, guns shattered. The air reeked of oil, cordite, and death. Here, in these killing fields, the reputation of both the German Tiger and the American Sherman would be forged. The first great confrontation came at Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944. The British 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, moved to exploit a gap in the German lines. Their column of Cromwells and Shermans rolled cautiously through the quiet town, unaware that death was waiting in the form of one man, SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger Eye of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. Villers-Bocage, the ambush of legends. At 9 a.m., Wittmann's Tiger emerged from concealment on a ridge overlooking the British column. What followed would become one of the most famous tank engagements in history. In less than 15 minutes, Wittmann destroyed an estimated 14 tanks, 15 half-tracks, and 2 anti-tank guns. His Tiger's 88mm cannon tore through British armor as if it were paper. Crews barely had time to react. Some tanks were hit before their turrets could even turn. The ambush threw the British advance into chaos. Columns halted, commanders fell back, radio traffic filled with panic. Whitman's name would become legend, a symbol of the Tiger's terrifying power. But that legend came at a price. Within hours, the Germans launched counterattacks that stalled under Allied artillery and airstrikes. Whitman himself was later killed in August when his Tiger was destroyed near Sinthos by either a British Firefly or a Typhoon rocket strike. The exact cause remains debated. His death marked the fading of an era, the age when a single tank could dominate a battlefield. The American struggle for St. Lo. While the British fought around Curran, the Americans faced their own crucible in the dense bocage near St. Lo. Here, the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions met the elite Panzer-led division, one of the best-equipped formations in the German army. The Panzer-led Panthers and Tigers lay in wait behind the hedgerows. Every field was a trap, every crossroads a kill zone. Sherman crews described the horror of shells slamming through their hulls without warning. Platoons were lost in seconds. But slowly, the Americans adapted. Instead of charging blindly, they coordinated. Infantry advanced ahead, spotting enemy armor. Artillery and fighter bombers were called in before tank assaults. The Shermans, often derided as inferior, began to move like a swarm, small groups maneuvering from multiple angles, overwhelming single German tanks with sheer numbers and precision. The U.S. 30th Infantry Division developed a chilling efficiency: spot, call air, move. The P-47 Thunderbolts overhead became the Sherman's guardian angels, swooping down with rockets and 500-pound bombs that could obliterate even a Tiger if hit directly. The breaking point. By late July, the Allied command, led by General Omar Bradley, launched Operation Cobra, a massive offensive aimed at breaking through German lines near St. Lo. On July 25, 3,000 Allied aircraft carpet-bombed a narrow front, followed by a thunderous armored advance. The German defense shattered. Panzer Lehr, once the pride of Hitler's army, was annihilated. Hundreds of Shermans surged through the breach, pushing west and south toward Avranches. What had once been a battle of tanks became a rout. For the first time, the German heavy armor found itself unable to hold the line. The Allies were no longer fighting for fields or villages. They were racing for open country. The Tiger and Panther still commanded fear, but they could no longer stem the tide. The Allies had learned, adapted, and multiplied. The Sherman, mocked for its simplicity, had become unstoppable, not through superiority of design, but through coordination and overwhelming presence. The power of coordination. The true weapon of the Allies was not any single machine. It was the system behind them. Every tank crew knew that if they were hit, medics, mechanics, and replacements would be there within days. Every advance was backed by fuel convoys, engineers, and communication lines stretching all the way to the beaches. For the Germans, each battle was a retreat deeper into scarcity. Fuel was rationed, spare parts were scavenged from wrecks, and their skies belonged to the enemy. A Tiger could win a fight, but not a war. By August 1944, the Allied breakout from Normandy was complete. The German front collapsed. Tens of thousands of troops were encircled and destroyed in the Falaise pocket. Among the wreckage lay hundreds of burnt-out tanks, Tigers, Panthers, and Shermans alike, twisted monuments to the brutal arithmetic of mechanized war. The question of who built the better tank was becoming meaningless. What mattered now was who could endure, and the answer was becoming clear. The German High Command, desperate to reclaim initiative, began preparing for a counterstroke, a final gamble that would test the will of both sides. And in that desperate winter, as snow blanketed the Ardennes, German steel would clash once more with the Sherman, in the last great tank offensive of the Western Front. The rise of the Firefly. By mid-1944, the Allies knew they needed a tank that could go toe-to-toe with the Tiger and Panther. The British, with their long tradition of tank design, found the solution not in a new chassis, but in a new gun. They took the proven 17-pounder, one of the most powerful anti-tank guns of the war, and forced it into the narrow turret of the M4 Sherman. The result was the Sherman Firefly, a hybrid born of necessity and ingenuity. Its gun was longer than the tank itself, awkward to maneuver in tight terrain. But it gave Allied crews something they had lacked since 1942, confidence. At last, they could strike back. On July 8, 1944, near Normandy, a single Firefly from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry destroyed 3 Tigers in rapid succession, including one commanded by the famed Michael Whitman, according to several accounts. Though historians debate the exact circumstances of Whitman's death, the symbolism was undeniable. The balance of power was shifting. The Tiger's fearsome reputation began to erode. The Firefly's long barrel became a psychological weapon of its own. German tankers were ordered to target them first, knowing what that gun could do. The Western Front unfolds. As the Allies pushed through France, the landscape changed from hedgerows to open fields. Here, the Sherman's mobility and reliability became decisive. Long convoys of tanks advanced through towns littered with German wrecks. The once proud Panzer divisions, outnumbered and starved of fuel, could only delay the inevitable. By August, Paris was liberated. The German army was in retreat. But Hitler refused to accept defeat. He demanded a counteroffensive, a strike that would split the Allied forces and seize the port of Antwerp. The operation would be his final gamble. Its name was Wattam Rhine. The world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes, winter 1944. In December 1944, the forests of the Ardennes were buried beneath snow. The quiet was deceptive. At dawn on December 16th, German artillery erupted across the line. Thousands of shells lit the sky, and German armor, including Tigers and Panthers from Panzer Lehr and SS Panzer divisions, surged through the mist. For the first time since Normandy, the Germans had surprise. The American lines buckled. Small towns like St. Vith, Bastogne, and La Gleize became scenes of desperate, close-range fighting. Sherman crews faced Tigers again, this time in the frozen forests rather than hedgerows. The cold made engines sluggish, optics fogged, and tracks froze solid. Crews fought not only the enemy but the elements. At Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, the 10th Armored Division and the 101st Airborne held out under siege. Shermans dug into snowbanks, covering crossroads and open approaches. Each battle became a contest of nerve, who could spot first, aim faster, and survive the first hit. When the weather cleared, Allied air power returned. P-47s and Typhoons once again turned the tide, hunting German tanks from above. The German offensive stalled, its fuel reserves depleted. Dozens of tanks, including many of the feared Panthers, were abandoned intact when their fuel ran dry. The collapse of the Panzer myth. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. Germany's last hope for turning the war had failed. Its armored divisions were shattered beyond recovery. In their retreat, the Germans left behind hundreds of burnt-out Tigers and Panthers, many destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. These wrecks, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, now littered the roads like monuments to a lost empire. The Sherman, meanwhile, kept rolling. In the closing months of the war, thousands of Shermans crossed the Rhine, spearheading the Allied advance into Germany itself. By the time they reached the Elbe River, the Sherman had become not only a weapon of war but a symbol of inevitability, the embodiment of Allied persistence. Even the Soviets, advancing from the east, were impressed. Lend-Lease had sent them hundreds of Shermans, which they used with respect, noting its reliability and comfort compared to their own T-34s. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Hitler's dream of armored domination lay buried beneath the ruins of his own cities. The final duels. The last tank battles of the Western Front were fought not for victory, but survival. German crews, often teenagers or old men, faced waves of Allied armor with dwindling ammunition. One of the final engagements came near Fassberg, in northern Germany. A handful of Tiger IIS, the monstrous Königstiger or King Tiger, faced advancing British and American columns. On paper, they were unstoppable, 70 tons of armor, an 88mm kilowatt K-43 gun capable of penetrating any Allied tank at over 2 kilometers. But most never reached the front. They broke down on the march or ran out of fuel before firing a shot. Of those that did, many were destroyed by aircraft or overwhelmed by massed Sherman attacks. By May 1945, the Panzerwaffe, the once feared armored force of Nazi Germany, was gone. The war of tanks was over. The duel between the Sherman and the Tiger had ended not with a single decisive victory, but with a gradual, grinding collapse of one side's ability to sustain the fight. Steel had met steel, and endurance had triumphed over perfection. The guns fell silent. Europe lay in ruins. The fields once scorched by tank fire were now quiet, littered with the husks of machines that had once defined empires. But history does not end with silence, it echoes. And in the years that followed, soldiers, engineers, and historians would look back at these tanks and ask, what truly won the war? The answer lay not only in armor thickness or gun caliber, but in something deeper, a lesson about the power of persistence in the face of fear. The end of the war left behind a continent of steel carcasses. Across France, Belgium, and Germany, fields were littered with the remains of Shermans, Panthers, and Tigers. Children played among their wrecks, unaware that these rusting giants had once decided the fate of nations. For the Allies, victory came not through invincibility, but through sheer persistence. The United States produced over 49,000 Shermans, more tanks than Germany could dream of matching. For every Tiger that rolled out of a German factory, roughly 50 Shermans crossed the Atlantic. That disparity told the real story of the war. Germany had built masterpieces. America had built an army. The Tiger was an engineering marvel, thick armor, precision optics, and a gun feared by all. But it was a mechanical burden. It required skilled maintenance, constant refueling, and a factory network that could no longer keep up with the pace of destruction. The Sherman, on the other hand, was simple, fast to repair, and easy to mass-produce. Parts were interchangeable, logistics were streamlined, and training was efficient. Crews could be replaced, tanks could be replaced, but the industrial rhythm never stopped. That rhythm won the war. By 1945, American production lines were churning out tanks faster than they could be shipped to the front. In contrast, German plants were bombed daily, crippled by fuel shortages and raw material collapse. The outcome was inevitable long before Berlin fell. Yet, to the men who fought, victory carried a heavy cost. Sherman crews paid dearly for every mile gained. Of the tens of thousands of tanks produced, thousands burned on the battlefield. The average life expectancy of a Sherman in combat was measured in weeks. Those who survived carried the memory for life, the deafening roar of the engine, the smell of burnt oil, the metallic taste of fear. Many later said they owed their survival not to armor or gunfire, but to luck and to the man sitting next to them. For the Germans, defeat was total. The panzer divisions that had once rolled across Europe were now piles of scrap. Many of their finest crews were dead or captured. The survivors looked back on the war not with pride, but disbelief. How could the invincible Tiger fall before such a crude, mass-produced machine? The answer was not in the tank. It was in the system behind it. The Tiger had been born of a nation obsessed with perfection, engineering without compromise. But war is not fought in laboratories. It is fought in mud, snow, and fire, where simplicity and reliability often matter more than brilliance. By 1946, the Sherman had become the tank of the New World Order. The US supplied them to dozens of allies, France, Britain, Israel, even Japan after the war. Many of these tanks continued fighting for decades, appearing again in Korea, the Middle East, and beyond. The Tiger, by contrast, disappeared almost overnight. Only a handful survived, preserved in museums. Its shadow, however, remained immense. It became legend, the monster of World War II, a name whispered in documentaries and wargames alike. But for the men who faced it, the legend was only half the truth. They remembered the terror, yes, but also the determination that followed. The realization that courage, numbers, and logistics could defeat even the most fearsome machine. In that truth lay the future of modern warfare, a future built not on fear, but on function. And as Europe rebuilt, the armies of the world began studying both tanks, not for nostalgia, but for lessons. Lessons in engineering, production, and the balance between quality and quantity. Those lessons would soon shape a new kind of battlefield, one defined not by Tigers or Shermans, but by their descendants, the main battle tanks of the Cold War. But before that new chapter began, the world had to come to terms with what had been lost, and what had been learned. When the war ended, the Sherman and the Tiger did not simply fade into history. They became symbols of two philosophies that would shape the rest of the 20th century. One stood for industrial democracy, mass production, and global logistics, a machine that any soldier could drive and any mechanic could repair. The other stood for precision autocracy, engineering perfection built by a nation that valued mastery over efficiency. Both left behind more than wreckage. They left blueprints for how future wars would be fought. The Sherman's legacy. In the post-war years, armies around the world looked to the Sherman as the model of practical design. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it proved that a good enough machine, produced in overwhelming numbers and supported by superior supply, could triumph over elite technology. This philosophy became the cornerstone of US and NATO doctrine throughout the Cold War. The idea was simple: quantity, coordination, and combined arms would always beat isolated superiority. The Sherman's descendants carried that DNA. The M26 Pershing, introduced late in the war, inherited its reliability but added a powerful 90mm gun. Later came the M46, M47, and M48 Patton series, each improving on the lessons learned in Europe. By the 1980s, the M1 Abrams, sleek, powerful, yet still rooted in mass production and logistical efficiency, embodied the same spirit that the Sherman had proven on the fields of Normandy. And while the Sherman became obsolete in frontline service by the 1950s, it lived on in other wars. In 1948, Israeli crews, many of them World War II veterans, fought Arab forces using refurbished Shermans. The tank's silhouette, once a symbol of American might, now fought under a new flag in the deserts of the Middle East. In Korea, it battled again, this time against Soviet T-34s, tanks whose designers had once respected the Sherman's practicality. Even in the jungles of Vietnam and the hills of Indochina, Shermans rolled one last time, their engines still rumbling decades after their German rivals had turned to rust. The Tiger's shadow. The Tiger, meanwhile, transcended reality and entered legend. It was remembered not for what it achieved strategically, but for how it made men feel. Allied soldiers spoke its name in fear. German veterans spoke it with reverence. Only about 1,350 Tigers were ever built. Yet its reputation outweighed its numbers 100-fold. It became a myth, the unbeatable beast, the symbol of German engineering genius. Even in defeat, it commanded respect. Post-war engineers studied captured Tigers with fascination. Its armor design, suspension, and gun accuracy influenced future tank technology, from the British Centurion to the Soviet IS series. But just as many lessons came from its flaws: the excessive weight, the complex mechanics, the logistical nightmare. Western and Soviet designers alike concluded that no matter how powerful a tank might be, it must remain reliable, maintainable, and replaceable. That realization became doctrine, shaping the armored balance of the Cold War. Memory and myth. In popular memory, the Tiger and the Sherman evolved into archetypes, mythic opposites in the collective imagination. Movies and games would later exaggerate the Tiger's invincibility, while often underplaying the Sherman's versatility. But history, stripped of myth, reveals something deeper. The Sherman's victory was not cinematic. It was industrial, logistical, and human. The Tiger's defeat was not dishonor. It was inevitability. In museums today, a few surviving Tigers stand silent under the gaze of visitors. Their massive tracks, thick armor, and towering guns still inspire awe. Across from them, in the same halls, sit the Shermans, smaller, simpler, but alive with the spirit of the men who fought in them. Together, they tell a story not of machines, but of mindsets. The clash between ambition and endurance, between precision and persistence. The world that followed took those lessons to heart. Modern warfare, from the deserts of Iraq to the plains of Ukraine, still reflects that balance. Technology matters, but adaptability wins. Power inspires fear, but numbers sustain victory. And though nearly a century has passed, the echo of that duel, when German tanks met American firepower, still rolls like distant thunder across the history of war. The last tank of that era now sits under glass, its paint faded, its engine silent. Yet in its cold steel, you can still sense the heartbeat of an age, the clash of ideologies, the courage of men, and the relentless rhythm of war itself. And from that silence comes reflection. The story of when German tanks met American firepower is not just about machines. It is about the nature of human conflict itself. In that meeting of steel, the world saw two visions of warfare collide. One, built on precision and perfection, the belief that superiority in design could conquer any enemy. The other, founded on practicality and persistence, the belief that victory belonged to those who could endure, adapt, and never stop moving forward. The Tiger was the pinnacle of engineering, every bolt crafted with care, every plate of armor fitted to perfection. It represented genius under pressure, the brilliance of men who sought to build the indestructible. But war is not a laboratory. It is chaos. And in chaos, perfection is fragile. The Sherman, by contrast, was imperfect by design, a compromise between firepower, mobility, and mass production. Yet it survived where perfection failed. It rolled over mountains, through mud and snow, across continents and oceans. It carried its crews into battles they should not have survived, and many did not. But the machine kept coming. In the end, the Sherman won not because it was better, but because it was enough, because the men inside it believed in what they fought for, and because the nation behind it understood that the greatest weapon of war is not a gun or an engine, but endurance. The Tiger and the Sherman now rest side by side in museums, their paint chipped, their tracks frozen in time. Children climb their hulls, unaware that these machines once decided the fate of the world. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending, for the greatest legacy of these tanks is not destruction. It is the peace that followed. A peace built on the lessons of endurance, unity, and the unshakable truth that no machine, no empire, and no ideology can stand forever against the will of free men working together. The roar of engines has faded, but the story of those who drove them, and the world they changed, still echoes in steel.